Hey everybody, it's a very sunny, hot Wednesday afternoon. Thanks for coming to class. It's week 6 of CS410J Advanced Java Programming. Lots of stuff to cover tonight. I just want a quick run through the agenda. First, we're going to talk about sort of like recap the week. Lots of exciting discussions about Project 4. I want to give you a chance to ask questions, provide feedback on that. As promised last week, I want to spend some time talking about GWT. And so we'll be spending a good amount of time sort of talking about that, going through the archetype and starting to get you guys thinking about that. And then with the remainder of class, I want to spend some more time working on that Pac-Man kata. Make some more progress there, see how you guys are doing. So that's what I want. Tonight, anything else people want to talk about other than those 3 things? So that's for the final exam.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, usually I'd say this until next week, but whatever. Final exam, it happens during class on whatever that is, August 13th. There are 2 parts to it. There's a written part and an oral part. The written part is basically like your quizzes. It's those same kinds of things. There's just more of them. And unlike your quizzes, they are not online. It's in here. You have to be answering questions. It's open book, open note, not open device. Kill some trees and familiarize yourselves with the notes. It contains everything, they contain everything you need. On the one hand, it's like, gee whiz, if you're just looking at PDFs, I wouldn't mind, but I can't tell unless I look over your shoulders whether you're looking at PDFs or whether you're, IMing somebody across the room asking for answers. So sorry about the no device thing. Other than that, it usually takes, a couple of hours, so expect to be here sort of the regular time. We'll start at 6 o'clock, and then that'll be it. And there's an oral part. That's nothing to worry about. And that's all I tell you. Don't worry about it. So yeah. Oh, and I guess as far as material is concerned, everything through this week, the content in week 7, the advanced GWT, because you don't have a chance to work with it, I'm not going to grade it on you. And the dependency injection stuff, I recommend that you watch the screencast. If I do ask you anything on dependency injection, though, it'll be pretty general. It won't be terribly specific. Okay. Yeah.
You said GWT. Because there's 2 parts. The first part will be on.
First part, yeah. So the first part is fair game. It's what your project's going to be about. So the stuff that has to deal with sort of fundamentals of GWT and what the widgets are, how events work, stuff like that. Yep, that's fair game. The advanced stuff with GWT, actually, I don't even have a screencast for that. I didn't get around to recording one. That stuff, while cool, is not something that I'm not going to hold you accountable for on the final exam. Okay.
How long, roughly, should we expect it to?
Like the usual amount of time. It'll probably be 2, a little bit more hours. Okay. Not just the front, but for both parts, yeah. How'd last week go? So lots of good questions on the Google Plus. Project 4, what'd you think? Feedback, comments? Yeah.
That sample project that you gave us, it was a lifesaver because.
Oh, okay, good.
Because before I actually looked at that, I was like, oh man, this is all so much. This is overwhelming. But then I looked at that, and there's just all laid out how everything talks to each other and communicates and works. And after looking at that and studying that for a bit, then all of a sudden actually understood how things were supposed to connect back and I could write it.
Okay, well that's good. Did anybody have the opposite feedback? I sort of got the feeling from some of the questions. I was worried that the sample code actually got in some people's way. Where it's like, oh, I spent so much time trying to figure out that sample is that I never, but no, does anybody have any feedback along those lines?
I mean, for me it was a little confusing at first because the code you gave us was key value stuff. That's what I thought what the assignment was supposed to be. Somehow,
okay, yep.
Supposed to work with that, and then once I realized, oh, that's not really the case, you can just kind of gut what you gave us and put in their own stuff, then it made more sense. But.
Okay. Cool, that's good. Yeah, so maybe I need to call that out a little bit more explicitly in the assignment that, hey, this is just an example, key value pairs. It's probably not what you want to do, but yeah, start from there.
Yeah,
okay.
People realize they have to gut most of it rather than
take the chainsaw.
Reuse it.
Right. And yeah, I think that's like my takeaway too, where like maybe Well, obviously in like the first project's Maven archetype, it was very much like, okay, here's the scaffolding and you fill in the middle, where this is like, here's something different and you need to figure out what you need to rip out and what you can reuse. Okay, fair, good deal. Any questions about Project 4? Anything open, anything that you struggled with that maybe you want to share with other people? Anything you thought was awesome?
I enjoyed making the form, and I think you should like include that in whatever next versions, so that like, students just have the form so that they can practice.
So that the form was helpful?
Yeah, because then it allowed me to actually see through like the web browser to be able to actually submit a post with the values to then see it like actually posting it up.
I like
Not necessarily that people want to like write it themselves, but to have it to check their work.
Could you do me a favor then and go on my GitHub site on the the source code and add an issue, sort of saying, hey, you should include this form on there. Yeah, I think that'd be super cool. I can do that without too much difficulty.
And it also completes the picture, because I spent a lot of time going back and forth of trying to figure out what was needed, why only part of the functionality was through the browser, but all the functionality was through the command line. And so that would put that balance, and you'd see that really these are two identical ways of getting at the same, instead of like one is incomplete, the other is.
Yeah, and actually it's interesting, I've given this project for several years now, and this is the first time where people really said, wait a second, I don't get it. There's like the get to the URL, and then there's everything else through the command line. And I was like, oh, interesting. I'm guessing that in previous terms, students had that same sort of cognitive dissonance, but they didn't speak up about it. So I appreciate the fact that you guys spoke up about it. Good deal. Anything else on Project 4? Mm-hmm. So I wanted to spend some time talking about GWT. I'm not exactly too sure how to approach it. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me sort of gauge where you guys are at then. Have you guys had a chance to watch the screencast on GWT? Who has? Only a couple people. Would it be beneficial, before I sort of dive into the assignment and the archetype and stuff, to touch over a couple of highlights of GWT? Okay, so let me bring up the slides. Let's see here. Can I shrink it a little bit? Oh wait, maybe I can just go full screen. There we go. Okay. Also not the best. Actually, no, sorry, let me do this the right way. Get a full screen and get out of this and go over here and just download it. Oh, that's not what I wanted though. Not in the least. Bother. Control, there we go. Open PSU. Slides. Okay. I'll try to hit the highlights here. So, who here has developed a web application? Oh, really? You realize it's the year 2014, right? Okay. Yeah, exactly. Okay, commentary aside, because I'll have to pause the recording. What was that? Yeah, okay, right. Who here has used the World Wide Web? Okay, good, everybody. Yes, okay, fine. Series of tubes, all that good stuff. Who here remembers the first time they saw Google Maps? Yeah, so those of us of a certain age remember Google Apps. And like Google Maps, and I don't know about you guys, but the first reaction that I had was, "Wow, that's really cool. How the hell did they do that?" And you start looking into it, and it's like, "Wow, they must use some like crazy Flash." No, it's all JavaScript. Well, you can do that with JavaScript and images and everything. Whoa! And this was the realization that like we all had probably close to 10 years ago, that the web as a platform has gotten to the point where you can have not just like, circa 1988 eBay user interface, but you can have some really rich user interactions and ones that approach or exceed what you have on the desktop. And so then this, there was really this like inflection, this turning point in terms of the technology that you can build web apps with. But if you look at the technologies that you have to use, it's things like HTML and CSS and JavaScript and DOM and this special browser object called the XHR, the Xml Http Request. And even though like these were standard, the browsers didn't support them very well, or didn't support them consistently. And so there was always like, if you look at like web development shops, there was always like this like troll guy who sat over in the corner, and he was the guy that knew exactly the right CSS magic for like Internet Explorer 6. And there was all of this like, folklore on how to use all of this stuff. Also, JavaScript at the time wasn't really viewed as a real programming language. Because you go and learn about it, and yeah, you could read, the Rhino book, but then when you look online, they're like really bad examples put together by like, people that were just learning, who were like 16, learning to program and things like that. And also, it looked differently enough that people kind of poo-poo-pooed it. But if you go and like you really read the spec and you really understand what it's supposed to be doing, JavaScript has some cool stuff. And also, there was a time, sort of early in the century, that web applications, if you were building something that was like enterprisey, if you were building like an Amazon or something like that, you had to sort of aim your web interface to the lowest common denominator. So, somebody who is working with an old browser, someone who's got like a dial-up connection, a user that's not very sophisticated. And then stuff started to happen. You look at like these social network applications started to appear, and all of a sudden, instead of like trying to sell books to someone who reads books, like that are paper, people who are old, it's like, wow, okay, people who are much more tech savvy, people that are, that have faster machines, that have much faster internet, and it enabled a whole bunch of new stuff. Well, fast forward, so you have this like ability to have like really cool and neat web interfaces, but like the programming languages and the technologies are still kind of spotty. Google, who obviously has a big stake in having rich internet applications, came up with something called Google Web Toolkit, which allows you to write a rich internet application, something that is deployed, that runs in a server and is served up to the client and gives them a really rich user experience, only using the Java programming language. So all these details that you had to know about HTML and layout and CSS and JavaScript and all this, that's all abstracted out for you by GWT. The reason they did this is because not only were sort of the technologies still underneath it still evolving and inconsistent, yet have all this folklore, but they hired a lot of Java developers to write on the back end and realized that, well, no, we can take those same Java developers and have them write on the front end. And so if the way you develop in GWT, so the APIs that you use and the concepts that are there are very similar to building desktop Java applications. So Swing. The whole idea is you've got objects that represent your widgets on the screen. Object represents a button. This one's a text field, and this one's a label. And you have other objects whose responsibilities is to lay out the widgets in the container. Okay, this guy goes in the northwest corner. This guy expands this way as the browser changes size, things like that. And then when it comes to handling interaction with the user, there's an event model, meaning that when the user clicks the mouse or types something on the keyboard or resizes a window, your program handles that by taking an object called an event that the GWT runtime generates and does something with it. It's like, oh, the user clicked this button here. Great, now I'll go make a call to the server, and I'll display the results of the call to the server back to the user in a pop-up, something like that. And so what the GWT gives you, and the reason I teach it in this class, is that it's familiar to Java programmers. It's the same language. They've even taken some of the Java APIs and adapted them so that they can be compiled into JavaScript and run in the browser. But you also can develop it in your IDE that you're used to, and that it may not be relevant for this class. But what GWT does is it takes Java source code and compiles that Java source code not into bytecode that runs on the JVM, but compiles into highly optimized JavaScript, which is then served up to the browser when you make a web request. So, cool stuff. Much more detail supplied in the screencast. So I'm just going to. I don't think there's really blah 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 blah.
Is it JavaScript, HTML, and CSS that it?
It is, yes, ultimately yes. So yeah, as we'll see in the example, there's a little bit of like HTML boilerplate, and that basically says, okay, is that HTML page that's served up and it has a JavaScript include of the compiled JavaScript, and the JavaScript starts with it's not a main method, it's like called onEntryPoint. So there is a Java method that's compiled into JavaScript that's executed that basically starts your page rendering, and it'll do things like create all your widgets and lay them out, and those widgets are actually the compiled JavaScript is rendered as DOM in the web browser. It's really quite novel. I don't think I've never heard of any other system doing it this way. And well, later on we can sort of debate the merits and things like that. And so, really, what I go through in the rest of the slides here are talking about GWT, the fact that it simulates a number of the standard JDK classes, so you can use things that are familiar to you, like an array list or a hash map and a string builder and things like that. It's kind of cool. And there's like Maven support for it, and there's some configuration files. I think what I want to do now, though, is first pause to see if you guys have any questions right off the bat, sort of conceptually about GWT. And then what we'll do is we'll talk about the project, and then we'll go through the Maven archetype that I put together to get you started. So, any questions conceptually?
Does it allow you to use like custom CSS? Or?
Absolutely, if you want, but you don't have to. And it's the thing that I find it approachable for this class, right? Because I've always taught graphical user interfaces, because after all, it's 1987 and people use graphical user interfaces. And so I used to teach Swing, which is like a very slow to launch desktop application that looks like you're running in 1998. Okay, some progress there. But we all run on the web now, and so then I wanted to have you guys do web programming. But I can't expect you guys in 8 weeks to learn Java and to learn CSS and HTML and JavaScript.
What do you do like AngularJS?
Right, well, and Angular wasn't around like when I started doing this. But even then, I think there's there's not enough overlap with like the advanced Java stuff to then justify. Oh yeah, and by the way, last 2 weeks of the class, JavaScript time. So anyway, actually, sorry, one more thing. So, because everything is Java compiled into JavaScript, you can do some neat things in terms of development versus deployment time. So, because all your code is Java, you can, while you're developing it, run in a special mode called hosted mode, where your Java code is not yet compiled into JavaScript, so it's not really running in a browser. Instead, it's running in this like emulated browser environment, sort of. And what you can do is all of that's running inside Java, so you can just do things like attach debugger to that, and you can click in the browser and have it, and the breakpoint will stop in your Java debugger. Here again, it's all about ease of development and letting you use the tools that you're used to using as a Java developer to write web applications. And we'll see some examples of this here. And so that's like during development, and then when you want to deploy it, you build everything, you compile all the JavaScript, that can all get put into a standard WAR file, right? It's a web application, just like the stuff that you're writing this for Project 4, and then you can deploy that WAR file into your web container and do stuff like that. Okay, Maven, you guys, okay, and then we go through a survey of all of the kind of widgets and stuff. I'll leave the notes there so we can come back to them if we need be. But I want to talk about the assignment next. So, well, that was GWT in 12 minutes. Your final project for the class was actually assigned last week and is due 2 weeks from tonight. is to write a rich internet application for your airline. So you've been building up this airline project. Now we're going to have all that functionality, including the search functionality from Project 4, will be available to your users through a rich internet application. I'd like you to use Google Web Toolkit, GWT, for that. And so really what I'd like you to get out of this project is to do some more complex client-server, web-based programming with GWT. But I also hope this is a fun assignment for you, an opportunity to maybe dive into a kind of programming that you haven't had a chance to do, and really exercise some creativity in terms of what the user experience is like. So what you're doing is putting a graphical user interface, a web interface, on top of your airline project using GWT, and so all that functionality is there. So creating an airline, entering flights, printing, searching, etc., etc. Yeah.
Does that include file writing and reading?
Oh, it does not. So no, your airline does not need to persist between server startup and when a server restarts. Good question. So unlike your command line programs, where the execution started with main, instead there is a class called airline GWT, which is a GWT entry point, which is what starts your application running, or at least the client side of your application running. So if you are running in GWT development mode, example of which we'll see very shortly, and you go to this URL, it should show your GWT hosted mode. It should show your web interface. So instead of like a README command line, because the command line is so last week, you're going to have a help menu that has a README menu item. So there's a way to create menus in GWT that displays everything that you would display in your README. It's interesting to note, I guess one other thing that I didn't point out yet, is that GWT has its own mechanism for communicating between the browser and the server. So you guys saw in Project 4, you wrote your own REST API, right, that you could hit in the browser and you hit in your client and all of that stuff. Well, forget all that, because GWT provides its own way of doing it that provides a very, that hides all the details of converting the, like your airline from an object to some text that's sent over the wire and back on the other, and an object on the other side. It has its own way of doing that. So you don't need to use the REST-based client that you developed, or the REST-based services that you developed in the previous project. So if something goes wrong, so if you've got a bad date format, or you get some internal exception or whatever, don't just spit it out to the command line, because here again the command line is so last week. Instead, you should pop up a dialog box that explains what the error is, or somehow you'll give a graphical interaction for displaying the error. So here again, be creative, use imagination. I guess I should say creative within limits. One of the things that Dave and I are going to do as we grade these, and it's probably going to be both of us grading them because there are a lot of you, is your interface needs to be intuitive enough that we can figure it out. If it takes us like 10 minutes to figure out where to put in the the start airport, the origin airport of your flight, yeah, you're not going to get a good grade. So you guys use the internet. You guys use user interfaces. I don't expect it to be like a gorgeous user interface, like Apple quality or whatever. But still, it should be intuitive enough that we can grade it without having to squint. Okay, and so I have an archetype, which we'll get back to in a moment. Maybe we'll get to it now. Oops. Okay, so, and the project is due 2 weeks from tonight. Any questions before we dive into the archetype? So does everybody sort of understand what you need to do at a conceptual level? Or rather, what is required of the project? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. Okay, good. Okay, so let's get started.
Actually, can I ask something real quick?
Absolutely.
For Project 4, while we could technically have support for multiple airlines, we only needed to support one.
Mm-hmm.
Does the same count for this?
Yeah, same thing here. Is one airline. Okay. So, okay. So we will create an archetype again, and this will give you a skeleton GWT project after it complains about all the stuff that doesn't cut and paste well, like this guy and login ID. Everybody see that okay? Is that big enough? Okay, is all that stuff right? Sure, that looks good. Okay. So now there's an airline GWT directory. I'm going to open it up in IntelliJ. Import project. Not the Pac-Man kata, but the airline GWT. You are Maven. Airline. And yep, let's do it. Really, and we want Java 8. I think we want Java, we want Java 8. Call it that. Open up a new window, please. Okay, loading. It's finding everything out. Okay, so here we've got the code. Let's go back to the project. Okay, so I've created this. You can build and run the project with Maven package. You can launch GWT's development mode with GWT run. You can also run your in production mode with run war and view it at that. So let's launch it. Let's build it. Oops. Airline GWT. So Maven package. We'll compile all the source code. It will. Oh, it's running GWT. Okay, so this is not only compiling the Java source code in bytecode, now it's compiling the Java source code, or some parts of the Java source code, the stuff that will go on the client side, into JavaScript. And it takes a moment or two. It's not the super fastest thing, because it's got to do a lot of work, because what it does is it creates different permutations of the Java, of JavaScript that are targeted to, like, IE and Firefox. What was the name of the engine that like Firefox and Chrome shares?
Gecko?
Yeah, Gecko and things like that. So just the same way, you've got like in C, you have cross compilers that can like target different different operating systems or different hardware architectures. Here you've got a cross compiler that can target different web browsers and optimize for different web browsers, right? So like maybe IE does this kind of event handling more optimally than Gecko does, et cetera, et cetera. So all sorts of cool stuff there. Okay, so I ran it. So the first thing we're going to run is development mode. So you say GWT run. Okay, so that compiles some stuff. And it's launching something called development mode. And so this is it's running, well, it's actually a Jetty server that's running a special web application that will serve up your GWT application. You can click Launch in Default Browser to launch it. Here it is. Okay, and so now this is displaying a GWT application. Let me make it a little bigger so we can all see it. It's a very simple thing. It's a web page that contains, this is the beginning of your GWT interface, and it has one button, and when I click on the button, it's going to ping the server. So this is a web browser, right? Nothing really magic here. It's a web browser that's running a web application, and when I click this button, it's going to make a call back to the server, and it pops up a dialog, which is kind of hard to read, I apologize, and what it does is it contains, it contains an airline and some flights that it got from the server. So lots of things going on here, right? You've got a web page, and that contains a button, and when you click on the button, it makes a call back to the server to get some information, and it displays it in an alert. Let's look at the page source to see if there's anything interesting here. Well, there's not a lot here. So basically all I've got is a very simple HTML file, which we'll see the source for in a moment, that includes this airline.nocache.js, which is another file that's bundled with your web application, served up by GWT. And it's got some regular old HTML. You can totally do that. But what this JavaScript does is will then add that button. And I think if you try to like look at the source, oh look, it is highly optimized and slightly obfuscated JavaScript. And all this JavaScript was compiled from your Java code. Okay. Oops. So enough view source. Let's go back here. Okay, so let's see here. Any questions? Okay. Yeah.
What if our browser complains when we try to pull up? We'll try to pull it up in the browser.
Is your browser complaining about a missing plugin?
Yes.
Yeah.
Install the plugin. That's a good point.
It's saying it only supports Firefox 3.0 to 26.0, but when I check my version, it gives me something higher.
Yeah, because 26 has been old for a few years
Yeah.
Oh.
now. Or a year. You can take out 24 and
Okay, so you can go get Firefox 24. Interesting. That is unfortunate. But yes, I would imagine Google Chrome might work a little better with Google Web Toolkit. And this is only in development mode. Yeah, okay, so right. Another technical aside. So I'd forgotten about the plugin because, of course, I installed it like a gazillion years ago. Yes, the reason it needs a browser plugin because you're running in development mode. And underneath the covers, what it's doing is that it's got this magical browser plugin so that when I click like this button, it doesn't really execute the JavaScript. What it does is it calls, or rather, through the JavaScript, it ends up calling the stuff on the back end. And like the code for that gets invoked when you click the server is really Java code instead of that JavaScript code. Because, oh, actually, can I attach with a debugger yet? I don't think I can. So let me, yeah. Anyway, I'll show you what happens in a little bit. So yeah, you need to if you want to use web mode. Sorry, if you want to use hosted mode, you need to install the plugin. Alternatively, you can just run in development mode. It'll be slower turnaround though, because oh yeah, one more thing that I forgot to mention. The way hosted mode works is that if I go and change my Java source code, all I need to do is reload the page. It'll recompile the Java code, and you can see your updates like that. So it gives you that same sort of quick turnaround that you're used to writing JavaScript, but you're writing Java. Okay, so let's start looking at source code.
Not to go too far back, but that reminds me of Project 4. I think it would have been, I spent too much time, like, not realizing that I had to restart my server in between. And it's also posted about that too.
All right.
It might be nice to, like, remind even more so students that, hey, when you...
Student of the future. Yeah.
When you make a change, make sure that you reload your server.
Yeah, reload that, yep. Yeah, it's a long-lived process. It's different, isn't it? It's not just the, hey, start here, start at the beginning of your main, exit at the end of your main, and that's it. It's, yeah. Education, here at Portland State. Okay, source code. So, standard Maven project layout with a couple of other things that I won't go into. You do have a web XML. There is this configuration called GWT.xml. I'll come back to that. If you look in your source code, there are 3 directories. Client, public, and server. In a GWT application, there's Java code that runs on the server, and this is just plain old Java code that you just like you wrote in your servlets. As a matter of fact, ultimately GWT is built on top of servlets because servlets work really well for handling HTTP requests, right? And so ultimately your backend code is just Java code, and that all goes in this server directory. So what's here in the server directory, this is the stuff that runs in the backend, that handles the request, is something called the ping service impl. That when that button is clicked, ultimately this ping method is called, and it returns an airline with 1 flight, and then sends that back to the server. Then there's code that's on the client side. This is the code that gets compiled into JavaScript into a JavaScript file, which is then turned into that airline.nocache.js. And so this code is off in its own directory. And here you've got classes like, well, airline GWT. This is like your main method. I'm going to expand that. And here, so airline GWT implements entry point. Entry point is a standard GWT interface that says, yep, this is where your application starts. And when that page is loaded, the onModuleLoad method is called. A module is like the is what sort of the element of the program is the it's where element on module load is what's invoked when your page is loaded in your browser. Okay, so what do we do here? We create a button. So GWT has a class called button that represents, well, a button. And you give a label, ping server. And that's this thing right here. I'll come back to it in a bit. But you can register something called a click handler. And a click handler is what's invoked when the button is clicked. We'll come back to that in a second. So I create my button, and I say I've got my button, and then I get something called the root panel. Root panel is a container in GWT that represents, well, basically the entire page that you're that you're part of. And so that is an object that represents the entire page. When everything's compiled and run in the browser, that's actually the DOM object of the body of the page. And you can add things to that container. So you can say add the button to the root panel. And that's how the button gets there. So this is the thing about GWT. You have Java code that builds, that you create these, instantiate these classes to get your widgets, in this case just a button, and then you add them to some container like the root panel, and there are lots of other panels that you can learn about by watching the screencast. And you add these widgets to the containers, and ultimately you add it to the page via the root panel, and you create this object representation of your page, and ultimately when it gets rendered, it all looks like this. So you build up these objects that represent your page. Just by themselves, though, not very interesting, right? You need to instruct your program on how to interact with the user. So you do that by registering events on, event handlers on widgets. So what we have here is we say, okay, we create our button, and then we register something called a click handler on it. Now, have you guys seen anonymous in our classes yet? Okay, some of you guys have. Is that you have a question, or?
Depends on if you've done swing before, which I've done swing before.
Yeah, or just sort of use it for other things. Okay.
You introduced it in one of the videos.
I did. I think the reflection lecture. Yeah. Which anyway, the whole idea here is that click handler is an interface, right? And it has one method on click. So this interface forms the contract between the GWT framework and your program. So GWT provides this button, and it knows that a button can be clicked. But GWT doesn't know what your program should do when the button is clicked. And so what it does instead is it says, okay, I understand something called a click handler. And if your program, I'm GWT, if your program hands me something that implements that click handler interface, I will invoke the onClick method when I am clicked. So the GWT and the GWT framework, GWT runtime, understands how to take the browser button click and turn it into something that is delivered to one of these click handlers. Actually what it does is it creates an object called a click event and delivers it to that click handler. It doesn't know what to do with that click. It doesn't know what to do in response to that click. It leaves that decision up to you. And the way you express that decision is by implementing the onClick method of this click handler. Okay? So when I'm telling, in my source code, I'm saying, okay, when this button is clicked, do the following. So what do I want to do? I want to make a call to the server. I want to ask the server, hey, give me the airline. And I'm going to print all of its flights. So, interesting thing about communicating between the the client and the server. Now, I'm guessing that in your project 4, when you, as I know because I wrote the code, I suppose. When in project 4, if you used the airline REST helper, or whatever that class was, airline REST client, there is a method that you can call that executes an HTTP GET on a URL, right? And so think about what your code does. You parse the command line, and now you're like, okay, great, I am adding a flight to my airline, and so you make the HTTP request. HTTP request goes out, and ultimately one process talks to another process over a socket. You make the request to the server, and if you start looking beneath the covers, what happens is that your program through the JVM finally gets down to the native operating system socket, and sends out a request. And then the socket and the HTTP protocol, well, on top of the TCP/IP protocol and all that stuff like that, is waiting for a response, waiting for a response, waiting for a response. And actually, if it waited too long, it would time out because there are timeouts here. But I don't think that ever happened to you guys. Instead, it would get to it would get the response from the server and then continue on. Well, your program, and when you're running with just two processes talking to each other, you can pretty much expect that there's going to be a well-established and reliable connection, but between the two. But on the web, not so much. And so when a browser, okay, sorry, backing up here. So 1996 style web applications were one page, and when you did something, the page always reloaded, right? Think HTML forms, right? Okay, you put in your stuff, you click, you get a different URL in your browser, or it does a post, and even if you have the same URL, the entire page reloads. And that's kind of like a user experience, right? You can't do things where it's I click in the middle of the page and stuff is displayed and everything like that. So 1996, you couldn't do that, but I don't remember when exactly, somewhere around 2000, browsers started supporting something called XHR, the XML Http Request, which is a special JavaScript object that lives inside the browser that lets you make calls back to the server without having to reload the entire page. So you click on a button. Or think about Google autocomplete or whatever, where you start typing something and then Google did you mean this? Did you mean this? Right? Start giving you all the samples. Think about how does that work, right? What happens is you start typing, the page has JavaScript and has registered a listener on that text field. You start typing, it starts getting what you typed, and it starts asking Google, hey, you start typing this. What does he really mean? That all happens with this request that doesn't cause the entire page to reload, except it basically has this other back channel back to the server. That connection right there is asynchronous, meaning that I go and I make a request and it returns immediately. That was weird. It returns immediately, and I basically will be told when the response comes back. So it's not like a regular method call where you call and you will not go to the next line of code until that is returned. Instead, it's I call it, and sometime later I'll be informed of when the response is available. And this is because there's latency there. And if you ever worked on a really slow machine, or over a really flaky internet connection where you're clicking on something and all of a sudden it slows down, it's not responsive anymore. And one of the reasons it's not responsive is because maybe it's writing a whole bunch of crap to the disk. And so it's you said save, and so your program's still waiting for stuff to be written, and so even though you're trying to do more things with it, it's basically nothing's happening. Well, that's what happens when you have a synchronous connection, right? So, or a synchronous request. It's I'm not going to do anything else until I've gotten that reply. Well, that doesn't make for a very good user experience, especially on the web where there might be a lot of latency between the request and the response. So instead, they have this asynchronous communication. Did that make sense? Okay, good. Right. So what does this mean for you, the GWT developer at home? It means that when you go and invoke something on the server, you make the request, And then sometime later, the response will come back, and the response will either be, yes, I was able to handle your request successfully, or nope, something went wrong. And the ways it's represented in GWT is the following. So ultimately what I want to do is I want to, back here on my server, I want to call this ping method right here, where I create a new airline and return it. This is server-side code. On the client, you have to do some interesting stuff. Because it's asynchronous, and because what you're doing is like this magical remote method invocation, you need to do a couple of things. First of all, you need to have, you get this magic async object. So, I'm sorry, one more step. The ping service implements an interface called ping service. This service has one method, ping, returns an abstract airline, and extends something called remote service. When you want to call, so this is the contract that that is provided by your service implementation. On the client side, so this service is running over on your server. You want to call from the client. What you say is, hey, GWT, create me a magical object that will let me invoke this code remotely. That will let me call a method in my client, have all the data magically serialized and sent to the server, execute the code on the server, and send me the result. As you can imagine, there's a lot of magic there, and so you call GWT create with the name of your interface, and what it returns you is something called the ping service async. Ping service async is an interface that has a method called ping. I think it has to be the same as the name of your ping service. Yes. And instead of returning a value, it takes an argument that's an async callback of that return value. Meaning, well, here, an async callback. So now we go back to the code here. We call the ping method, which makes the request, and the response to that request, the result of invoking that method, isn't returned immediately, because it's an asynchronous call. Instead, it is delivered to an object that implements this async callback of abstract airline, and it's got two methods. The first is on failure. So if there's some exception that's thrown, like it timed out, or you got a null pointer exception while trying to handle the request, whatever, this on failure method will be invoked. However, if the call is successful, the result of that call will be delivered to this on success method, and then you can do whatever you want with it. In this case, we create a new string builder with all of the data that's here in this abstract airline, and we call window.alert, which pops up the JavaScript alert with that context. This is one of the more, I found that this, understanding this concept is challenging for students, especially when you're sort of used to a very straight line program where you start here and then you make calls and maybe come back. This is, but understanding this complexity and learning to work with these abstractions is key to user interface programming, right? User interface programming is all event-driven, right? What you do is you pop up your user interface and then you step back, and the program sort of steps back and says, okay, user, click this button here, type this text here, and I'll handle it for you. So you don't necessarily know when or what order your code's going to be invoked in, right? So it's not sort of the straight line program that we're all used to. And because of that, because it is because user interface programming is inherently asynchronous and inherently event-driven, your code needs to look a little different. So your code is about handling events. And really, you're delegating a lot of responsibility off to the GWT framework to set up everything on the page and to sort of then tell you when and how the user is interacting with your code. And so not only is there that, but now, so not only do you have not only do you have event-driven programming, but you have distributed programming because you've got stuff happening in your browser, like the user clicking the buttons and stuff, and then your browser is making calls back to your server to do more work. Things like get your airline or whatever your application. So the majority of your application logic is on the server side. The vast majority of your user interaction logic is on the client side. And when these two things are in different programming languages, probably written by different people, that can get really complicated. So when that's what GWT is, because everything's in the same language using pretty much the same libraries and things like that, it's easy to go between the two. At least that's the theory anyway. I want to pause here for questions. Yeah.
The ping service async.
Mm-hmm.
So we're creating the async, and then we do the async.ping.
Yeah.
So I'm struggling to understand how the ping service async maps to the ping.
Excellent question. That's not something I covered. So, right, ping service async. Some of this is just magic, and then some. Well, magic in that. Well, no, actually, magic. There are two pieces of magic. Well, there's lots of magic in GWT. Two pieces that seem even more magical. The first is the compiler. So the GWT compiler. Sorry, what was the second one going to be? Oh, the GWT create. Right. Okay. So at compile time, the GWT compiler is very smart about the analysis it does on the program. Its job is to create highly optimized JavaScript, and so it does all sorts of analysis and relies on things and relies on certain conventions. So, for instance, the convention that says, okay, if you've got ping service, then you've got a class. So, sorry, if you've got an interface called ping service, then that is sort of shared between the client and the server. So notice this is in the client code. Then you've also got an async version of that, and the compiler will tell you if the signature for the async ping does not match the signature of the corresponding ping service ping. And so there are certain conventions that the compiler enforces. It also uses things like this. Certain conventions the compiler enforces. Another thing that you need to do is you need to tell the GWT compiler how to find the implementation of this ping service. So you do it with the ping service impl, but you also do it with this annotation right here. And this annotation says the remote service relative path. This says, okay, when the implementation of this service interface is deployed in a web container, like your Jetty or whatever, its URL will be like /ping, so application /ping. That is, let's see here. So this interface, this annotation is necessary here. Also here in the GWT XML, in addition to like having some essentially imports. This is where you also tell GWT that yes, the ping service impl will be available at the path /ping. There's a little bit of glue here that I hope the archetype takes care of for you, and so you can listen to the lecture and get more details here. But yeah, there's some amount of there's I think a reasonable minimal amount of configuration to sort of get everything hooked together. But once it does, it feels much more like Java programming than having to do like JavaScript and Java and things like that. Did I answer your question? Actually, maybe I answered half of your question. So that's sort of like the compile time, everything going together. Now at runtime, there's GWT create. And is that where like you were going with your next question?
Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So GWT create is it a compile time or is it a runtime? So GWT create, yeah. GWT create is like the special method that the compiler pays attention to and says, oh, look, okay, they're about to do something special. So the class that you provide to GWT create at compile time, the compiler will look up ping service and say, oh, look, ping service extends remote service. Okay, it then needs to create a it'll create this magical, I guess is the only word for it, this magical JavaScript object that will handle the remote call from the client to the server. So when you call ping, so when this runs as JavaScript, when ping is called on this async, what it does is it goes off and makes the call to the server, and it knows what URL to do because of this ping annotation right there. So it puts together the URL back to the server /ping, and what it does, I guess ping, well, let's see here, ping takes 0 arguments, but if there were arguments, as a matter of fact, you're going to have asynchronous methods with arguments, like when you go to create your flight, right? It'll take all of those arguments and do what you had to do in your project for. It took the Java object that represents those arguments, turns it into text, sends the text in the body of an HTTP request off to the server. Then on the server, so right, this is calling between the client and the server. Think about what you did in Project 4. On Project 4, you took the command line arguments, you took those command line arguments and ultimately created an HTTP request with those arguments in the body. It was a post, send it off to the server. On the server side, your airline servlet, the doPost method, was invoked. You looked at all the parameters and created a new flight object and added it to your airline, right? You did something like that. Like all those steps of marshalling the strings back and forth and creating the objects. GWT takes care of a lot of that for you in that it has its own it has its own mechanisms for passing what are essentially Java, or what look like Java objects between the client and the server. So for instance, what happens here, I call ping, and because there are, ultimately, if we look at the ping service, there are no arguments here. And now I'm kind of wishing that I had put some arguments there, because it'll make for a better example. But it says, hey, no arguments, now just call the ping method. Okay, so what does the magical ping service async implementation do? Which, by the way, you provide the ping service async method. Isn't that interesting? There is no direct implementation of this interface. IntelliJ is smart enough to say, oh, well, this async is really the same as this ping service, but it doesn't really extend it or anything. That's IntelliJ just being nice. You don't provide an implementation of this. Instead, at runtime, GWT will generate one for you. So you call ping. It forms the URL for calling the ping service. It makes a call to the server. Ultimately, the server, well, because in the GWT XML, you told it, hey, when you see a request for /ping, please route it to the ping service impl. Right, so now on the server side, your code, oh, by the way, ping service impl, it extends remote service servlet. This is a Java servlet, right? Ultimately, if you go up the class hierarchy, this is just a servlet. Now, you don't have to implement the do get and the do post because GWT has done that for you. So you extend from a GWT servlet, which takes care of reading their data in their wire format. And basically what it does is it says, okay, look, what was passed from the client is, here's the name of the method that I want you to invoke. It'll be called ping. It reads that off the wire and then uses Java reflection to invoke the ping. Because this over here is a server-side code. This is regular Java world. This is bytecode. This is the JVM. This is not JavaScript. This is the server side. And so there's all of this sort of routing that happens up, it's in logic that's inherited from the remote service servlet, and ultimately your code is invoked. So you create your airline, you add your airline, and now you return your airline. And so what happens? When you return, you're back in GWT land. GWT takes your airline object, and in a process called serialization, picks it apart, turns it into text, sends it back to the client. The magical ping service async object generated by the GWT runtime will take the data off the wire, this text string that represents the airline, will reconstitute an object for it and deliver it to the onSuccess method. But you know what? You don't need to worry about all that stuff on the inside, right? You just see that, okay, when I successfully invoke my ping method, I get my abstract airline, and now I can do something with it. So lots of magic under the covers, really cool stuff if you want to learn about it. You don't have to learn about it, though, in order to be successful with GWT. So that's how the round trip works. Any other questions?
Yeah, so we will need to edit the XML file.
You will need to edit the XML file as much as it is to. You could change the /ping, but you'll probably want to rename your ping service impl. Now, IntelliJ, if you go and rename ping service impl, call it what airline. Sorry, do this. Well, finish it. You know, airline service simple. IntelliJ is smart enough to rename it in the XML file.
Because we'll need like two servlet paths, one that's maybe like a search and one that's an add. Or...
Not necessarily, because you can have multiple methods on a service, right? So you could have an add flight method, you could have a search method, you could have a get readme method, whatever you want. Yeah. You'd have to have them on the service interface too. So the service interface could have multiple methods and then you'd also need to have the async variation of all those methods. But no, that's probably the preferred way of doing it. What's in the public? Oh, the HTML file that lives in public. And you might want to mess around with this. So in the if you have some boilerplate text or whatever, feel free to put it into the HTML, et cetera, et cetera. So, any other questions? Yeah.
So, our page is going to have user input.
Yes.
Where do you validate?
Where do you validate the user input? So yeah, you're entering a date, and the date is the format that that you're used to. You probably want to you probably have a nicer user experience if you validated it in the browser on the client side, and you do that you can write that validation logic in Java code in the client under the client hierarchy. So for instance. Well, I don't really, so I'm kind of reluctant to add more code here. Right. Yeah, so one of the, sorry, I'm getting lost here. Here it's like when the button's clicked. There are other events that you can get when like a text field loses keyboard focus. So it's like I've entered some text and tabbed onto another field or I've clicked outside it. You can register something to receive event when the text field loses keyboard focus, and when it does, you can go get the text out of the text field that was entered by the user, and you can see if it's a valid date, and if it is, great. And if it's not, you can turn the box red. You can pop up you can pop up a dialog. You can make a call off to the server and download a GIF and have a cat hanging from a tree, whatever you want, right? Right. So I encourage you to spend a little bit of time with the GPT API that's online, with the part of the screencast where I sort of go through the catalog and here are all the widgets and here's how to deal with all the events and things like that. And I think that will hopefully unleash some creativity or at least give you some things that you want to explore with. Yeah, keep asking. Same as always, so 72 hours before the assignment, so not this Sunday night, but the Sunday night after that. Yep.
Do a short example with text input, like echo back text box field.
Sure. Sorry, what would you like?
On the text box has user input, just echo it back and press the button. Something simple that
Okay.
shows you extended.
Sure, I'll give that a try. Text field is probably what I want. Text field, enter text here. And now when I, let's see here, I need to create, what other panels are there? Sorry. Let's take a look at the GWT API. Let's take a readable look at the GWT API. Okay, so let's see here. Text field is in the, oh, that's AWT. That's wrong. Sorry. This is kind of GWT. user client UI. Whew, they have a lot of stuff in here now. User client, RPM, user client UI. Okay, this is the package that contains all of the widgets, a gazillion interfaces. But here are the classes. We want something like text field. No, really? Text box, that's what it's called. Okay, so text box. So you can see that there's this whole hierarchy of classes to represent sort of something just like text box. A focus widget, which means that can get keyboard focus, things like that. This is kind of nice. It sort of tells you, like, if you wanted to do advanced styling and stuff like that, not necessary for this class, but it says how to do it. Gives you a little example of how to use it, which is cool. And then it's got methods on it, things like that. You can specify, the max length, how much is visible, etc., etc. Okay, so now we'll have text box, text equals new text box, text box. I think you can give like, oh no, you can't have initial content, so you can say set text to type here. And now, instead of invoking the ping service, I'll just say window.alert. No, wait, that's the wrong window, I think. Window.alert. And then we'll say text.getText. Because it's an anonymous inner class, I need to make this final, just like that. And now, in addition, I can't, oh maybe I can. Can I add the text also? That might not work, I'm not sure. No, let's see, now the real test. If I reload this, oh, wow, that's impossible to read. Okay, so that didn't work. Yeah, I must have to restart the server. That's weird. Oh, I didn't check the error here. It's just dumb with me. It's thinking, it's loading. Great, okay. So now type here, it's like, hello class. Click the ping server, hello class. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
That's starting to make sense? So there's like 3 steps in...
All that code is done on the client side, right?
Yes, so all this code right here is compiled, and the reason you know it's in the client package. All this code is compiled into the client side. Actually, one more thing I want to show you, and then it's time for a break. I've been talking forever. Export Maven ops server suspend. Okay, so now I'm going to run it in. Oh, actually, wait a second. Set that. If you do Maven gwt debug, this runs in development mode, but runs it with the debugger turned on. So now you can attach with your debugger. This will be a remote VM, just like we've learned about before. And we want port 8000, which is apparently what it runs on. You can tell because it was telling you it right there, socket 8000. I think it's configurable in the POM. And now I want to run it. Okay, I'm attached. It launches debug mode. And now I'm going to set a breakpoint there. I'm going to set a breakpoint there. Oops, now I'm going to go back here. It's telling me I disconnected. I'm going to reload it. It's going to load. And it stopped in my debugger. Oh, look, now it's creating the text field. I can step here. It's slow. So it hasn't come back yet when I do the next line. Oh my lord, is it slow. It's still loading there. My fan is starting to like go. So, yeah. Oops. Did I come back yet? That's probably dumb. Ooh. Now the computer's working hard. So we're gonna play the elevator music. Oh, come on, make it look bad. Wait, Jeff BP, anybody? Rerun. Well, anyway, you can run it in debug mode, so you can attach a debugger to it. So if your computer is faster than mine, someday, oh, yeah, okay, it's, well, yeah, because I'm stopping the debugger. I'll detach. It'll finish loading. I will attach again. I'll click my button and stop at the breakpoint in. All right, okay. So this is one of the cool things about GWT. Everything's in Java. I can debug it in IntelliJ, just like I'm used to. It's actually running in Java, and so look, I can get all sorts of information about the event. I can get information about the text field. If there was more, logic here, you'd be able to debug it. If you've ever tried to debug like a JavaScript application that you've written yourself, especially if you're using like 2004 era tools, it's really hard. This makes it much, much easier. So anyway, this is all cool. So this is what GWT is all about. So I guess any questions before we take a little break? No. I just want to summarize. So what you'll be doing for the rest of the course is developing a rich internet application for your airline. And I hope GWT, even though there's a lot to learn, I hope it feels familiar to you because it is Java programming. You'll be applying everything that you've learned in the first 6 weeks of this course to this work. So it's object-oriented programming, it's Java docs, it's all the language stuff that you've learned, is the tools that you've learned like IntelliJ, stuff like that. I hope you have fun with the project. This is meant to be an exercise in creativity. I hope it's not an exercise in frustration. That was project 4. No. I guess, well, anyway. So I think that's all I want to say about that. Please go watch the screencast. If you have any more questions, of course, ask them on the Google Plus community. So let's take a break, and let's take a longer break, 15 minutes. So we'll start up again when the big hand is on 6. Thanks.